go and hand over to Susan.
Thank you, Claire. Hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar this Wednesday. We're talking today about working with freight agents and avoiding the headaches that we often have when we do work with freight agents. Now, the first thing to say is that with Brexit, then there's quite a high likelihood that more people will be working with freight agents than do today, because as we need customs entries done for every movement of goods after Brexit from the 1st of January, then people will be looking to freight agents to actually make those entries for them. So it's very important to understand what freight agents do and how you can interact with them in a way that prevents problems rather than actually makes problems, which so often happens, unfortunately. The first thing to say is, who are we talking about? Well, freight agents, freight forwarders, courier companies, fast parcel operators, there's loads of different names for exactly the same idea of company. It doesn't really matter which name they get called. It just depends what they offer, because not all freight agents, freight forwarders, etc. are equal. Some offer a particular service for a particular method of transport. They may be air freight specialists, but no good at road. Some have a particular geographic specialism. So they may be very good for Africa, but completely useless for America. So we have to be very careful when we pick our freight agent, and some will only do certain types of goods. So some may be very excellent specialists at automotive, but food stuff isn't part of what they do, so they're not very good at food stuff. So it's up to us, the exporter and the importer, to make sure that the freight agent chosen is actually fit for purpose, for our purpose. They may well be very good at their jobs, but if we pick the one with the wrong job, then we're not going to get the service we want, we're not going to get the supply chain we want, and we're going to get a lot of interaction and headaches because it's not what they really do. So it's up to us as the exporter and importer to find out about these freight agents and find out what their specialisms are and whether they are the best agent for our purposes for what we intend in the supply chain. So that being said, we've then got to look at what they actually offer, because some say they are global companies. Now, what do they mean by that? Well, most people assume they mean as a global country, whatever the name of if it's Susan Morley Freight Agent Limited, then Susan Morley Freight Agent Limited will be in Australia, America, and wherever else they happen to operate. Well, that's very rarely the case. Mostly freight agents work with somebody else, a third company, someone with whom they have a contract or a subcontract, not the same company name at all, and they're not affiliated in any way. They're simply subcontractors. That in itself can alter the relationships that you would have with your freight agent at your end of the transaction. Some appear to be global companies. If you take people like DHL, FedEx, UPS, all those big fast parcel companies or courier companies, actually, although the name is UPS or FedEx in every country around the world, they're not the same company. They are actually separate companies, usually geographically based, and there are the usual handoffs and contracts between those companies, just the same as if they had different names. And this is something that people don't realize and therefore don't understand why there's time lapses and contradictions and difficulties between one end of the supply chain and the other. But it's because the freight agents may work well or may not work well with the other end, with the subcontract agent at the other end. And that's something else we can research and find out about, ask questions about before we go into actually using them. This choice is really important. So what else does a freight agent offer us? Well, usually cheaper freight rates than we could get ourselves, because they can buy in bulk, and therefore they get discounts that we could not get for our cargo because we don't have enough cargo to offer the airline or the shipping company or the haulier. So in those circumstances, they very often offer us cheap rates. But the next question comes up and is a source of immense confusion in companies, is how do you work out the rates? What do you do about these cheap rates that they're offering? Maybe they've said it's going to be £2 a kilo or $5 a kilo or something. Well, is that it? Did you just take your kilo weight, multiply it by that and think that's what I'm going to pay? Well, if you did, you would be sadly disappointed, because that will not be all that you have to pay, because there's lots of add-ons to that basic freight rate. These are ancillaries, they're sometimes called. They're fees for what goes on in the port or the airport or at the haulage company's depot. And there's also fees for delay, demurrage, we call that in shipping and air freight, and for extra added things where they might do extra packaging for you or have to do particular documentation that involves them taking a piece of paper somewhere. These will all be extra to that quoted freight rate of so many pounds a kilo. But that's not the only place where confusion creeps in. And I must say that some of those delay rates and currency adjustment rates and what we call fuel adjustment, bunkerage adjustment rates, are often not actually known until the end of the voyage or the air freight journey. So you've always got to be prepared for these extra add-ons, which will come very late in the day, unprepared for, and you're liable as the importer or the exporter, whoever's paying. Your small print of your contract with the agent says you're going to pay regardless. You don't have a get-out clause for that. So you should always allow some flexibility, shall we call it, when quoting freight rates and telling your colleagues what the freight cost will be, because you can't actually predict it fully until the end of the journey, when it's actually delivered. But there's an extra layer to this that most people don't realise, I suppose. They don't publicise it very well. And that's that freight would be either gross or volumetric. Now, what does that mean? Well, that depends on the method of transport. What they're trying to weigh up is if you've got an airline and an aircraft, a particular size airplane, then there's only so much room for cargo. So they're trying to weigh up how much weight can they lift versus how much space will it take up. This is the gross v volumetric calculation. Because if you're shipping polystyrene, you could very well fill the hold of an aircraft and there'd be next to no weight. So if they charged you on the weight, they wouldn't get enough money to cover their costs. So they want to charge you on the volume. However, if you were shipping lead bricks or cement, you could probably only put a couple of bags in the bottom of that aircraft before it was too heavy for it to take off. You could never fill the whole of the hold. So again, if they're charging you on the volume, they're not going to make enough money to cover their costs. So this is what the calculation is between gross weight and volumetric. Now with air freight, they usually use a silly, well, it's a divisor, it's a figure that they've worked out of 6,000. So you take the dimensions of your package in centimetres, you multiply them together, and you do that for each package that you wish to send, and arrive at a total for each package, and then add up the grand total for all of the packages. So length times height times breadth equals whatever it equals, and then multiply that by however many packages you've got. You then divide that grand total by 6,000, and the answer you get is what's known as volumetric kilos. So if you've got a package that weighs actually gross weight, that's its actual weight packed of 10 kilos, but then when you do your volumetric calculation on the package, it works out as an answer of 15 kilos. That £2 per kilo that you were told is going to be £2 times 15, not £2 times 10, because it's whichever is the greater, the gross weight or the volumetric weight. Now, other methods of transport use a different divisor. It's not always 6,000. The fast parcels people, DHL, FedEx, etc., usually use 5,000. And road freight is a little more flexible. There's different combinations, but it could be as low as 4,000. The lower the number, the more you're going to pay, is the actual answer to that. So if you haven't calculated that first, or you've looked at a simple rate chart, such as some of the fast parcels people issue, and you've run along the top and found a destination and down the side with the kilos, and all you've done is the gross weight, you have probably vastly underestimated the freight cost that you are going to be charged. That's even without considering those add-ons that I mentioned. So you've got to really understand your gross volumetric, which leads, of course, to packaging decisions. The bigger the package, the more you're going to pay. You're shipping air, or in the worst of cases, polystyrene, when you really had a tiny little item in the middle. So you really need to balance the safety of the cargo versus the size of the box, because the bigger it is, the more you're going to pay. That is for certain. And sometimes the bigger the box causes immense trouble because it won't go on the airline, for instance, that the freight agent has arranged. If you leave it forever to tell the freight agent how big your box is going to be, and you leave it till the day before dispatch, and they've already booked you space on an airline, you could be in trouble if your cargo is too tall for the aircraft door, because they only load in the belly holds of most aircraft, and that door is about the same height as you and me. So if your parcel's taller than that, they're going to lay it down, which may break your cargo inside, and it will make for difficulties all round because it may still not go through the door. Therefore, you've got trouble, delay, it won't fly as booked, and more costs come in, and it all starts to snowball from there. With sea freight, it's a little more obvious usually because it's one of those containers, 20 foot, 35 foot, 40 foot long, 8 foot high usually, although you can get slightly taller ones that are 9 foot. So packing it in there is easier. You've either packed a whole container at your place, so you know whether it's going in or not because you've physically seen it, or it's packed for you by the freight agent. Did you arrange that, by the way? And therefore, they're going to be worrying about how big's your pallets. Did you have any pallets? Have they got to put loose boxes in a container? That's going to cost you more because instead of one quick forklift, you're going to have 2 or 3 people handballing the boxes into the container. So you've got to think about this backwards, if you like, through to the packaging level. And that will determine a lot of your cost. So be careful on that one. But what we have to remember is, however good the freight agent may be at organising transport, that is their specialism, and all of the things that go with the permissions and costs that go with moving about in ports and airports and road haulage and running trucks and things, they're no substitute for the importer and the exporter actually having the knowledge to direct operations. And that extends to customs work as well. They are not the answer to an exporter's prayer of phone them up, they collect it, and everything else is done for you. It may be done for you, but who has the legal liability? And was it done correctly, according to the law, at both ends? So you can't, as an exporter or an importer, ever escape the legal liability. For customs work, customs demand that you give instructions to your chosen agent in writing. Can be email, that's fine, but it must be written instructions. So what are you going to include in these instructions? Is it that you give them an export invoice and say, there you are, that's it, off you go, sort it all out for me? Some people do that, but that's not actually a written instruction as to what to do. And it may have different information or less information than is actually required. What do they need to know? Well, the first thing, which sounds self-evident, but people forget, is the addresses. They need to know who's the exporter's address and company name. They need to know the importer's address and company name, and they need to know the delivery address in full detail. Now, all those 3 addresses could be completely different to the seller's address and the buyer's address. So you've got to give all this information. You shouldn't be letting them try and guess. They don't have crystal balls, well, at least not functioning ones. So you really need to give that information out. So we've got addresses to be given in full with the proper legal company name, not just Morley or something like that. We've got to have Morley Consulting Limited or Morley Consulting Training Limited, the full legal name of the company. So having got over the addresses, we then have to consider what is it we wish to send. So then we need a goods description. Now, if you think for a minute that it might say on your invoice, because many ERP systems are minimalist to say the least, 1 bucket. Well, you've got a quantity and you've got a description. But what bucket? Is it the sort of bucket you'd put on a JCB for digging up the roads? Or is it a bucket you'd have in your household? A small orange plastic one, something like that. What's it made of? Is it a metal bucket? Does it have a handle? How big is it? You see, without this, we can't move into the customs realm, and we can't move into assessing what kind of paperwork or special licensing is required for the item. Now, the exporter should know these things, of course, because you are the exporter, you're supposed to know your product. So you've got to tell the agent who hasn't seen the product and doesn't know anything about it. Otherwise, you're leaving them guessing as to what kind of bucket that might be. Now, just imagine for your goods how much confusion could be put into the supply chain by an inadequate description. We really can't live with an inadequate description. The next thing we might need, other than quantity and total quantity, is the price. What's the unit price, the total price with currency? But then we need an Incoterm. All shipments should have Incoterms. And we need to have that to understand many things. What are you, the exporter, responsible for? Which elements of the supply chain are you, the exporter, paying this freight agent for? And which ones should he look to the importer to pay for at the other end? This is of vital importance to you and to the freight agent who's making the arrangements. So we need this Incoterm. We need to understand its relationship to the value. If you've picked an Incoterm that would include freight, is freight built into the price you've given as the unit price? Is it to be shown separately? What's to happen to that? We have to know this before we can do the export. So pricing is important. We also need a tariff code. This is the customs way of describing a product, and it would be a different code for the bucket of a JCB than it would be for your orange plastic bucket for use in the garden. So we've got to be able to understand the tariff code, and it's not for the freight agent to choose it. It is for the exporter and the importer to choose the tariff code. It's your legal liability to get it right, and you are the one who will take penalties if it's wrong. So if you give an inadequate description, leave your freight agent to guess the tariff code based on that description, you can see where many of the headaches come from. They don't immediately come, well, sometimes they come immediately, so the goods don't get to be exported or imported appropriately, but other times they come back to bite you later on an audit or with queries from customs at a later date. So we've got to get that instruction right. We also have to give the origin of the goods. And this is not something that's geographic. It's not where you are as the exporter. It's all to do with an economic origin, which is a calculated origin of the goods. And only you, the exporter, can actually know that. The importer can't. It's the exporter who can know that. And you have to give that origin as the origin, either the non-preferential origin or a preferential origin. Could be two different ones. And you have to provide that to the freight agent. Again, they have no way of being able to guess that at all. And that could have huge consequences at import. So we've got to be very clear that we give all of this information in some form or other to the freight agent. Now, other than it has to be in writing, there is no format for this. It's usually said to be clearance instructions if it is the import end, and it's usually given as export shipping instructions and ECSI on the export end. But the actual format for these data elements is up to you, the exporter and the importer, but they should all be there. Some freight agents offer you a form to fill in where they've got all of the different things listed and you have to just fill in beside them as a kind of checklist, but not all of them do that. So you've got to be ready to provide your own instructions and to make sure they're clear. Another thing at the import end that has to be provided is how do you intend as the importer to pay the import duties and VAT? Do you have a deferment account? Are you paying cash? Do you want to ask the freight agent to use their deferment account? Because they can do, but they'll charge you a fee, a percentage usually of the duties and taxes to be paid. And that will have to be paid up front before the goods are released. Have you factored that into your costs? How is that going to work in your supply chain? Because if that's not clear, there will be a delay at import while people figure out what's to be done. And this should be known in advance, not something you work out on the fly as the goods are stuck in customs. It's not a good idea. Also on our written instructions, we should as well as giving information, we should demand information from the freight agent. And that would be things like documents. You want a copy airway bill or bill of lading for sea freight, or a CMR note for road, or a CIM note for rail. You want copies of those. You want copies of the customs entries. You want to see their freight invoice in detail, not single figure. You want a listing of all the elements that made it up. And you want them back in, so normally it's say 48 hours of dispatch or clearance. You want them quickly. And you want them quickly because the idea is you're going to check them. And you're going to see that everything you told the freight agent to do, they have actually done. You want to know if there was any discrepancy. If you thought there was one package and it was 15 kilos, and now they've reweighed it and made it 25 kilos and are charging you for 25. Do you agree with that? Do you disagree with that? What about the customs entry? Did they use the right tariff code? Did their fingers get in a knot and they've got the numbers back to front? You should be looking at this, you should be checking all of this, and you should be keeping audit records of what you've done, as well as correcting anything you find that isn't right. Everyone's human, mistakes can be made. So we've got to make sure it is actually right, because you have the legal liability. And customs will make your life unhappy if it's wrong, because you have the legal liability again, and they'll charge you penalties for every error you make. And yes, I did say every error you make. I know the freight agent put the information into the customs computer for you. They are very well equipped to do that, but they can make mistakes. But that mistake is yours, not theirs. They are your agent. And this is what we refer to as indirect responsibility and direct responsibility in the supply chain for freight agents. Direct means that direct representation is when they simply do what you tell them. Hopefully they do it right, but it's all you, it's all your information, and they have no legal liability whatsoever. That is the norm around the world. That is, if you don't talk about it, that's what you're going to get, direct representation. Indirect representation is a much rarer animal, and that is where they share liability with you. This is very rare. You might get it if you're using a 5PL who's doing almost everything for you and is integrated as part of your business. Then they're part of you at that point, but it's quite rare otherwise. But indirect representation means they take equal liability with you. Customs will come to you first. You still have the primary liability, but if they can't get the money from you, if you like, for the duty or the penalties, they will then go to the freight agent who has to pay. And that's why it's very, very rare, because they don't want the liability for something you told them that was wrong, or that you didn't tell them and they had to guess. They're not interested in taking the liability for that for very obvious reasons. So we need to get that right as well. Now, how does that work with a courier company? Because you don't give a written instruction to the courier company, you go onto their website and you make a booking. Well, making the booking is giving them the instructions. Everything you type in there about your item is the instruction sheet we have just discussed. So who's doing that typing in? Who's writing in the description? Who's using a drop-down list from 30 years ago and the product's changed now? Did someone change the tariff codes recently? Or have they been there for 20 years? They change monthly, by the way. So you need to know who's doing that input to the booking system. What do they know? Do they have the right information? Are they inputting it properly? And what about the defaults that's been set by you or by the courier company? Are they right, or were they not right for your circumstance? Is there a defaulted Incoterm that's going to cause trouble because it's not actually relevant to your shipment? You need to check all of this and have processes and procedures in place that are going to make sure whoever is making these bookings, whether they use a written instruction to an agent or through a courier system, they know what they're doing, they've got the right information, they've got all of the information, and they know how to input it to pass it on. This is very, very important. And then, of course, you have to keep everything that you've done for 7 years, because that's the limitation on tax, which is involved in every shipment we do. So as you can see, it's a lot of this. I've not been talking about the capabilities of the agent. I've been talking about the capabilities of the importer and the exporter before the agent gets their hands on it and perhaps human error creeps in. there is a lot of possibilities for human error when doing this work. A lot of them, I think you can see. Now, at that point, I'll open this to questions if you have any.
Okay, everybody, I'm going to unmute you now. So if you have a question, please ask it now. Do we have any questions?
I don't think everyone's unmuted.
I'm working on that. Bruce and Ola, I am unable to unmute you. Now you are unmuted. So if you have a question, please ask it now. There don't appear to be any questions from the floor. Could you perhaps give us an overview of how the choice of your freight agent may have an impact on your AEO, on a company's AEO efforts and the impact upon that?
Okay, yes. Well, AEO is certification for exporters and importers and freight agents, if they want it, which is all to do with competence. So first we have competence for customs if you're an AEOC, and you will have competence for security and safety in the supply chain if you're an AEOS. Now, freight agents clearly should have AEOS. Well, why not? Why wouldn't they get it if they're competent in making sure the supply chain is safe and secure, which is surely what every importer and exporter wants. And as an exporter, you would want probably AEOC to say how you know how to run customs, because all of your instructions you're giving to the agent is customs compliance. You'd also perhaps want AEOS so that you make sure your supply chain is safe and secure. And the impact there is that an exporter who has AEOS and C is looking to a freight agent who's got AEOS and C, because you wouldn't want to lower the standards of your supply chain. But equally, as we have mutual recognition agreements between AEOs across different countries, this is the benefit, one of the biggest benefits of AEO certification. You want to make sure as an exporter that your entire supply chain is AEO. So it's not just your freight agent you want to be AEOS, for example. You want the airline or the shipping company to be AEOS. You want the port handlers to be AEOS. So everyone in the supply chain needs to be AEOS in order that the importer is going to get the benefit of that AEO status. They need to be AEOS too. So you need the whole supply chain to be AEO'd, if we can call it that, in order for the importer to get the benefit. And this is a regular assessment. We've got to assess the risk of not having AEO in the supply chain, because if even one of those companies is not, then you've broken the supply chain for AEO and your importer will not get the benefits that they were expecting. And for example, in America, if you go by sea freight, if your whole chain is AEO, they call it CTPAT in America, just to be different. But so long as the whole supply chain is AEO, they won't X-ray the goods on import. That can save you a week. Now, if you've broken the supply chain by using a freight agent who doesn't have AEO, in this country, for instance, then they'll have to have their goods X-rayed despite the fact everybody else is AEO. So there's a big impact, and your assessment of who you choose as a freight agent and a fast parcel operator should include that, because your importer may be relying on that speed in your supply chain and will be very unhappy if they don't get it. Hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any other questions? No, I don't think we have any other questions. So at that point, we will say thank you, everybody, for attending this afternoon. We hope you found this useful. We have more webinars. We have one next Wednesday about whether to insure or not to insure your goods during transit. Do feel free to register for that. You can look at that on the website. And there are video recordings of all of these webinars available there that have already taken place.